Thanks for joining me for another reflection, this time focusing on racial justice as we explore Black Lives Matter in the light of Christian faith and solidarity with my Black sisters and brothers. And this is where I've reached so far. See if it helps you. Resurrection is a disaster. We'll come back to that in a moment. First, another window to look through. I started to think about this some time ago because it was something on TV at the time, but it's become more pertinent now in the light of the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests around the world. I don't know whether you saw the recent BBC drama series, Noughts and Crosses, based on the novel by Marjorie Blackman. I'd not read the book, but I did try to follow the series because it really has a very interesting idea at the heart of it, even if I wasn't persuaded by everything about it. The key idea is that a place called Africa, the homeland of black people, has actually colonised many other parts of the world, including Albion, a place not unlike Britain. The result is that those with power in Albion are black, and those at the bottom of society are white, and the story consists of a government tightening up its treatment of the Noughts, the whites. Obviously, the vital thing that it's getting us to reflect on is the way in which, in our real world, white people just don't notice what it's like to live in a world where black people experience so-called casual racism through so many institutions and transactions and relationships. Seeing things flipped the other way around confronts us with questions about what we assume to be normal and what we don't notice within the normal. So the same world is experienced in very different ways depending on your location. But what I particularly want to reflect on is how the drama was introduced or described quite often before each episode, often as a dystopian drama. And I wondered what makes it dystopian. Sometimes it was simply called a speculative fiction or an alternative history, as the book seems to have been described, which seems a fairer description, because what is it about a dystopia? A dystopia is a future in which everything has gone wrong. So why call this alternative world dystopian? Presumably people would say it's because the government was behaving in ways which verged on totalitarian, but actually much of what it was doing wasn't much worse than many white-led governments, certainly in history, but even today. So I can't avoid the conclusion that white people were calling it dystopian because of an inbuilt assumption, unconscious as it may have been, that black people shouldn't be in charge. And if they are, it's a dystopian future. That might not have been intended at all, but it seems to be the backdrop to that sort of description of it as dystopian. Of course, for black people, that's not dystopian at all. It's a reversal of fortune, a turning of the tables, which isn't to say that it's a utopia either, because it's clearly not a world of justice and peace wherever there is domination with one group over another. Even so, is it dystopian? If so, who for? What is dystopian? Is it dystopian for a group of protesters to pull down a statue of a slave owner? Or is it far from dystopian? Is it instead the expression of an incoming world interrogating the status quo? Or across the pond in the US, might it be dystopian for an American president to hold the Bible as though it's some sort of totem, some sort of foundation stone for a world order in which it's normal to tear gas peaceful protesters for a macho photo opportunity? Is that legitimate, or is that dystopian? Is it dystopian to prioritise the status quo, editing out the forgotten bits of history, or is it dystopian to envisage a new world in which we reckon with our history and possibilise, if that's a word, an alternative future? What sort of dystopian visionary are you, and what sort am I? What I view as dystopian might just depend on what I stand to lose or gain. Where is my solidarity rooted? The point is, the same reality is experienced very differently by different people, depending on what we have to lose, what we have to gain, where we're located. So too with resurrection. For the followers of Jesus, his death was the disaster, and his resurrection was the sign that the system was cracked and an alternative future was possible and was present even in their midst. But for the authorities, his death was the victory, and resurrection was the disaster. They thought they'd silenced his speculative fiction, his alternative kingdom, this new kind of history breaking in to the old history. But it turned out they hadn't silenced him. The dystopian movement lived again. Which makes me wonder, where do I locate myself in that? Guardian of the status quo, beneficiary of the existing world order, reluctant to embrace a new reality, calling it a dystopia instead? Or daring to encourage that unknown world to seep through the crack and reshape life as we know it? In the context of racism, where the challenge is not merely to be not racist, trying to do away with any personal prejudices we might have, but is to go further, to be anti-racist, to reckon with structural racism, and to root it out. As part of a movement of solidarity, learning from Black experience, where that is the challenge, it's right to recognise that Black experience puts its finger on something very subtle and insidious, the ideology and worldview of whiteness, within which those of us who are white are rooted, and which conditions whether we see alternatives as dystopian or as utopian. I might be incredibly well-intentioned. I might try to listen hard to Black experience. I might want to do the right thing, but whiteness keeps conditioning me, like a groupthink which shapes my prejudices and shapes the balance of power. A balance of power skewed in my favour in many respects. So to unpick it is uncomfortable. It is to be shaken by realities I'd rather not contend with. It's a bit like the rich young man, as he's often called in Mark chapter 10, who has a lot of wealth, who comes asking Jesus what he must do to inherit into eternal life. And he can demonstrate a checklist of well-meaning things he has done. He has kept this law, he has kept that law. But Jesus asks him to do just one more thing, to sell his property and give the proceeds to the poor. But it's too much for him. He walks on his way. He walks away. It would be an invitation, a requirement to stand on his head, not simply by facing up to his privilege and voting against it with his money, but shaking his assumption that eternal life is something that can be inherited, like property, like privilege. So the privileges which come with whiteness, which are inherited, even if we didn't ask for them as such, they become the burden, the statue, the edited version of history, the thing around our neck which must be given up. This pandemic has continued to expose for us the injustices of structural racism, as the relative poverty and vulnerability of ethnic minorities has been revealed further. But also it has exposed the different visions of the future which different people have, whether to resume normality as soon as possible, or to hope that something new might just come, against the odds, against the weight of history. Change won't just happen. The inertia of the status quo has too much of a hold over us for things just to happen, to fall out of the sky. In the context of racism, whiteness is a difficult inheritance to address. Its assumptions are insidious, its power over us too complex and subtle for us even to notice all of its complexity, and so we make it out to be too complex to address. And so for many, to unpick it will feel like a dystopia. But for many others, those who can't breathe, those longing for new breath, new possibilities, an alternative future, this crack in the system, represented by the pandemic, this crack in the system is a tiny opportunity, the possibility of something new emerging. For me, in some respects, change can be dystopian, an inconvenience, a disruption to my inheritance, but I am constantly invited to say and demonstrate with whom it is that I seek to be in solidarity. And what sort of world do I hope for? Racial justice is just part of the picture. There is also economic and ecological justice too. Ecological justice becoming even more urgent in the light of increasing evidence of climate catastrophe. And all of these things challenge my inheritance, the things that I currently benefit from. But in the light of resurrection, a huge disaster in so many ways, maybe I can join in with those who desperately need that dystopia to come true.